Amazing. Hello, everyone, and welcome to Chevalier's Books Online. We're so excited to have you here tonight. Before I introduce our guest this evening, a couple of notes. We have a really incredible conversation in store for you, and you'll have the chance to ask these wonderful writers questions near the end of the hour. But until then, we ask that you please keep your microphone muted. You can share comments and stories in the chat, which I'm sure you'll want to do considering who we have here with us tonight. But until then, just stay on mute to help facilitate the conversation. And first, I'd like to introduce to you F. Douglas Brown, who is the author of two really stunning poetry collections, 0 to 3, and most recently, Icon. Currently, he teaches American literature and African American poetry at Loyola High School here in Los Angeles. And he's also the co-founder and curator of Unfadable, the Requiem for Sandra Bland, which is a really remarkable quarterly reading series which fuses restorative justice with poetry. He's here to discuss Show Them You're Good, which is the newest book from Jeff Hobbs. Jeff is also the author of the novel The Tourist and the nonfiction tour de force, The Brief and Tragic Life of Robert Peace. If you've ever been to Chevalier's, you know that's an absolute staff favorite, and we cannot recommend it enough. Jeff and Douglas, thank you so much for joining us tonight.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Well, it's an honor to be here with you, Jeff, as we talked about earlier, and an honor to read this book because, at least just from my point of view, it felt a little bit as if you were honoring me. Just a quick little bio about me. I am a native of San Francisco, and I grew up in Hunters Point, an area very similar to Watts or Compton. And you know, in the late '80s, saw much of the blight, and as a community in transition, and seeing the things that have changed, and felt very much like the boys who you profile here. And I think for me as a writer, that has really inspired me to kind of keep those voices alive. And I just see that with your work in general. And I want to go back maybe to talk about, you know, your previous book, The Short and Tragic Life of Robert Peace. And from my understanding of that book, I really feel, and seeing you in an interview, I really feel like three things in that book really kind of play into this book. This idea of, you said about Robert playing the role and having to don this mask or to be authentic in different places. This idea of being dedicated to his community, and this romantic vision of himself of trying to bridge all of those worlds. Maybe you could talk about like that how that story of Robert, your friend and former roommate, really led you to these stories of these young men here in LA.
Sure, and thank you, Douglas. I was going to say Mr. Brown, but maybe you get enough of that during the day.
All day.
But, no, thank you for doing this. I'm so glad to be here with you, and just your work as a poet, as a working with youth, and as a teacher. Writing this book is about schools, and I got to spend a lot of time with teachers and a lot of time, you know, watching teachers who have the magic. And I already admired teachers, but I came out of this project with a real reverence. My publisher calls it compassionate witness, which I think is just a highfalutin term for being with people and seeing people and listening to people. So again, I'm really grateful to be here with you. And thanks also for mentioning Rob Peace. He was, if you hadn't read the book, he was a close friend, and he died violently too young. And the book was, I didn't set out to write a book. It was more just a community of people trying to sort of celebrate his life, and we celebrate by telling stories. And so the book is sort of a eulogy that got way out of hand. But at the center of that book is school. I mean, he went to a Jesuit high school, a pretty strict, pretty wonderful school, and a school where maybe one place he didn't necessarily have to wear a mask, and he could sort of be himself. And the most special part of researching that book was the time they let me spend at his high school called St. Benedict's Prep in downtown Newark, New Jersey. And as far as that book to this one, I mean, that book was special. It was personal. It was hard. And when it came out, it was hard. You know, just because he wasn't there, I missed him. But a very terrifying thing happened when that book came out, which is that schools began reaching out to me and asking me to come and maybe do an assembly or visit some classes or just Skype into a lunch or an English class. And you can already tell after a few minutes that I was never meant to, you know, speak in front of people or speak in general, really. But you know, my wife said, you're, you know, a middle-aged man, you can figure out how to speak. So I got this privilege of visiting schools and being with students kind of all around the country, just figuring out how to get there, and whether it was an auditorium with, you know, 1,400 kids or, you know, a small group, 2 or 3 kids. There was something about Rob Peace and his story and his character that really empowered young people to tell their own stories during these conversations, to just stand up and say, you know, this is me. Now tell me about you. And it's meaningful. It's astonishing, especially to watch young men assume that kind of vulnerability. And I don't know, I carried that home with me from each of these trips, you know, Ivy League colleges and juvenile halls and a lot of spaces in between, and just thought maybe there was some way to capture that meaning without sort of hanging it over a sports team or an educational system or a device. Just kind of meet some kids and show what it looks like and feels like to be 17 years old in America right now. And yeah, a couple schools, one in South LA, Florence Graham area, one in Beverly Hills. They let me, for better or for worse, hang around their schools.
Well, it seems like in terms of the tenderness, you've really caught that, and the tenderness of these young men that we don't normally see, right? Especially when we talk about LA Unified, the second largest school district in the country, right? And there's just so vast number of kids that we tend to want to concentrate. And when I say we, I mean the society at large wants to concentrate on the failures of those schools instead of the successes. And you've obviously really grounded yourself in that, and grounded yourself in the story of these. And it's not like you're observing them. It really feels like you're walking with them. Maybe talk about that a little bit, like the way you wrote this or the process to write this.
Oh, sure. And it means a lot that you would mention that or notice that. And the tenderness maybe that you mentioned, it just came from the boys. This is a book about boys going through their senior year of high school. And so the process, what we did, I mean, I went to classes, I went to dances, I went to family dinners. I did not go to off-campus sort of parties, just for my own sanity, probably. I was invited, but the center of it was a small group of 4 or 5 boys in each school. Once or twice a week, we'd just sit in a room after school, a classroom, and just talk for usually around 2 hours, but sometimes 3, once or twice even 4 hours. These boys just came and they sat. I brought food, which maybe was why they came.
Number one with working with youth, right? You got to bring the food.
If In-N-Out Burger had a platinum membership card, I would be first. And I would have prompts and whatnot, current events, and the college admissions cycle as it progressed. But I didn't really need them. They seemed to have a nice time just being together and talking about what was on their mind, stuff at home, stuff they'd been through earlier in their lives, stuff that was going on right now. Just sort of I mean, a lot of it's chaos, the
Right.
interior mind of a teenager in general. But, these are guys making some of their first adult decisions, and they're projecting themselves into the world beyond their high schools. Sometimes for the first time, they're growing up pretty fast. I mean, some of the guys in South LA in particular have had to grow up pretty fast because of some of the things they've been through, which I'd be glad to talk about. But yeah, the tenderness was just the tenderness that they had with each other, just making each other feel safe and unjudged, and as I said before, sort of seen.
Yeah, definitely to feel seen. And I love that what your publisher said, this compassionate witness that you've become. And their own friendships really like amazed me too. Like I think there was a moment where they're walking through LACMA and looking at the art, and I just love that. I love, me teaching at an all boys school. I get to see them in moments where I don't think a lot of people, when you look at Loyola or any kind of Jesuit school, I think the first thing you think of is sports. And I think you capture that and their own aspirations to be, runners or whatever it is. But also just this idea of like, they see things differently. They see the world differently. And my time at Loyola, I've really appreciated that. You see boys talking about or singing, Hamilton songs, and then are, yelling their heads off at a football game or something like that. It's one of the things we really miss right now during this time is to see that. And I love that. I love how you capture their own friendships too.
Yeah, and I mean, I think male friendship is sort of another bridge that came from the life of Robert Peace.
Mm-hmm.
In that he was a tremendous friend to people from all over, from his childhood, people he met along the way. Again, he was sort of a safe and unjudging person. But at the same time, something typical of male friendship is that mantra, like, it's all good, I'm all good, I've got this. And kind of an aversion to vulnerability and feelings. And, it's still a machismo culture we live in, and sports are a big deal. I like sports. But the emotional lives of boys are pretty serious and pretty special. I'm thinking of a moment sort of toward the end of the book, once college admission results were coming in, and it went pretty well for some guys. It went poorly for other guys, and we were in the classroom before the meeting. I explained, and there was a kid, Carlos, a kid who didn't speak English when he began elementary school, and I'm giving away the ending, but he's at Yale now. So the process for him worked out spectacularly, and he was sitting next to a guy he'd known since fourth grade named Tio, for whom it had gone not the way he hoped. And Tio was just saying, I worked my ass off to get A's. I want to be an engineer. Everyone told me, if you want to be an engineer, you can be an engineer, follow your dreams. But that's not the way life is. I could have just not worked. I could have just skateboarded. I could have gotten C's, and I'd still be going to school that accepted me. And I just remember Carlos he didn't try to placate him or use the platitudes that adults use, like it's all going to work out. You still are the maker of your own destiny. All true things, but Carlos knew just to put his hand on Tio's shoulder and not say anything. And they just kind of hung their heads a little bit together. Just a little human contact.
That's it.
I don't know.
That's it. Well, you must have, you say you didn't go into the teaching profession, but you knew how to create that intimacy to let those students go. I know how it is teaching seniors at this moment when, like you said, things seem chaotic and the next level of their lives, they just don't know about, and I know about it firsthand. I really quite remember it really well as a teacher, and then having gone through it last year with my daughter, who was just graduated from high school in May. And yeah, and it's a little different with girls. Olivia was like, I got it, but she really had it. And the boys, they need these outlets because they won't seek it out. And so my class this year in particular, I really want to be intentional about it. You have this line that says, college was competitive. The statistics of space and bodies and grades and money were daunting on their own for millions of prospective high school students in America. But numbers didn't account for the layers of emotion and their stakes. And so I love that line, and I really honed in on that because I really see my classroom, or at least the subject matter, as being a place where they could just be creative without any stakes, other than just to let the emotion out and to let it ride. And it's been a great place of intimacy and solace, at least for me, on it, and it fights against Tio, he's a fantastic student. I would love to have taught him. He's a bit surly, it seemed like, and tough, but it seemed like he's just a really fantastic student. And it just seemed like the aspirations of the students, they were fighting against the aspirations of what society was telling them, and then the aspirations of their parents, And so maybe we could talk about like the role of the adults, how you came into contact with them, or how you saw the role of the adults. I feel like I'm a lot like Ms. Kim. I'm pretty kind of tough. And then outside of the class, I'm very, very loving of them, but maybe talk about the adults and how you interacted with them, or the students interacted with them.
That's kind of a very large canvas, and I really loved hearing from you about your experience in the classroom. And again, just people letting me kind of witness that magic was very special. So I met all the adults, the parents and grandparents in some cases. I didn't want this to be a book about, teaching systems, school systems, or parenting styles, but it was neat to sort of see the across these boys who are all very different boys, just to see the range of kind of over-parenting and under-parenting, and also to see the teachers that they gravitate toward. Often I think it holds true that often sort of the most demanding, difficult teachers are the most reviled in the moment, but the most beloved in retrospect. So that's where the value of being with them for a whole year, and you sort of watch all of that shift around. Um, what was funny to hear them saying the exact opposite thing about the exact same person 6 months apart. Um, once the punishment's behind them. But one thing that stood out was, regardless of the parents and how involved they were and how together they were, was just how attuned all these guys were to sort of the absurdity of life and adult hypocrisy. A small example is how we, as parents, look up from our phones just long enough to tell a kid to get off his phone. Um, but there's greater things about, you preach open-heartedness and not being judgy, but they hear us at dinner talking about the neighbors, and they see it all and they intake it all and they laugh about most of it. But at times they just seemed very mature in comparison to a lot of the adults in their lives and a lot of the, adults that I know.
Right. There's that a brief part where the coach tells him to say something to the driver, right? On the bus driver.
The running.
And then the coach doesn't do it. And then one of the boys says, "Hey, coach, you didn't say anything to the driver." And the coach kind of says, "Well, I didn't have to because whatever, right?" And there it is, like that hypocrisy that's right in their face all the time. And yeah, they're so observant, right? They pay attention to so much all the time.
And I mean, the moment you mentioned is with Tio, and as you said, Tio can have a little bit of an attitude sometimes. So, he might not have pointed it out in the most nuanced way.
Maybe go back. I know you mentioned something about where they come from and being in South LA. And there's this moment with Carlos talking about Compton and where he's from and watching his father. And Carlos seems very wise. He seemed like a very wise young man and very, very reverent of his family and the things that he does. He's someone who has a short little afternoon job that he does from time to time. And he's just very impressive young man, regardless of this idea of the elite, which he talks about. Can you talk a little bit about his idea?
Of course. Carlos is the student I mentioned who was undocumented. So he was applying for deferred action for childhood arrivals at the same time as he was applying to Ivy League schools. And he's the kid you read articles about in the paper from time to time, just the superstar kid. But when you sit with him, he doesn't act like a superstar. He's very humble, cares, just as much about setting up the decorations for a Halloween dance as he does about, interviewing for his Yale alumni interview, that kind of stuff. Mm-hmm. So he was the real model of the school. And an extra complication in his life was that his older brother, also undocumented, was already at Yale. So, he was the star student, but he's also living in his brother's shadow, which, probably isn't a motif you normally associate with a kid from South LA. So mm-hmm. It was all these complicated things, and he was dealing with lots of narratives that society forms around high-performing students, and he dealt with that nobly. But I think the hardest thing he dealt with was a kind of resentment, a latent resentment among his peers, um, that he did so well. That wasn't usually in his face, but he could sense it. Maybe he sensed it some places where it didn't really exist, but almost like a suspicion that his family was withholding some secret to their success, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and I asked him once about that, and he didn't get mad, but he kind of rolled his eyes, and he said, "Just listen. My parents read to me when I was a kid. They set expectations without rewards and punishment. We had family dinners. We talked about our days. We basically did everything that any parenting book would probably tell anybody to do. There was nothing that special."
Right.
But then we kept talking, and other kids talked, and it came back, and he said one thing was that when he was in middle school, his father, who drove a delivery truck, long days, at night his father would sit with him while he did homework in middle school, which I guess was algebra and American Lit, the first compositions. And his father would sit with him and ask him questions about his homework and kind of watch him do it, not as an overseer, just as a companion. And as he got older, he realized that his dad didn't understand anything that he was doing. His dad, didn't have much education, didn't, understand trigonometry, couldn't really follow anything. He was just putting in those hours to be with him and to show interest, show that he cared, which I thought was meaningful. Both that happened, and that Carlos was wise enough to see it for what it was and take that to heart.
Oh, I love that. And there it is. That's the intimacy. It just doesn't happen overnight. Like it's been something that's built in and over time with them.
Sorry, you have me kind of weepy a little bit tonight, but a lot of this book is pretty funny, and I think there's a lot of frivolous things that happen as well.
Sorry, it's the poet in me. I want to go to those heartstrings. I told you, on the side, I'm a DJ and I love music. And, this moment with John and music and the piano and that shared moment with parents and music, and with his father, how they knew the lines of Springsteen and whatnot. And maybe to kind of talk more about that. And I love that so much, because I feel that in a moment, and we're just working with teenagers, so much of them is trying to find themselves, and they're pulling away from the nest, as they should, and they're testing the waters, right? They're testing it. And I felt when it was happening for my son, my daughter, or even the students that I have, I tend to latch onto music, because music is that thing that pulls us together and that I could talk to with them. And it, not that it makes everything go away, but for that moment, we really could see each other. There's no hierarchy, right? And we're not playing like my music is better than your music and whatever. We're really trying to show each other something about ourselves that all the other things kind of get in the way, right? And it just felt like that moment with John, what he talked about as an early pianist and so on. Tell us a little bit about that.
So John is one of the students at Beverly Hills, and like many students in Beverly Hills High School, his family, lives in a small apartment that they scrap pretty hard to afford, specifically so that he can go through that school system. Um, um, and so a lot of his journey is sorting through the friction caused by, sharing a small space. He's an only child with two adults, and figuring out that a lot of the friction between parents and children comes from love.
Hmm.
And so his mother is Chinese and his father's Jewish, and so there's sort of torrents of Eastern shame and Western guilt pouring down on him, and he's kind of manically active at school and all the extracurriculars, and his parents can't keep up, and there's a lot of distance. But like you said, music, sitting with his father, listening to some Springsteen, and then his father used to work at a radio station, so at some point, whenever they're bonding this way, his dad tells the story about how Springsteen actually came to the E Street Band actually came to the radio station and had a softball game against the employees there. Um, one of those sweet things your dad says that you can roll your eyes at. Um, and yeah, and then there's a story with the piano where one of his rebellions against his mother involved quitting piano, which she was very serious about. And a few years went by, and she kind of tricked him into taking it up again. It's kind of an intricate story, but again, part of the wonder of doing this project was seeing these guys sort of look back and analyze those moments together, and figure out that their parents are wise too.
Right. It reminded me, I guess I get weepy at those points too. I've recently introduced my youngest daughter to Sound of Music. She loves that. And there's that moment in Sound of Music, if you're familiar with it, where the father is so stoic and then he starts to sing. And when the kids look at him, they look at him and they just elevate the father on a pedestal that he was already on, but their eyes, the way they hold him, and I just feel that I could see John loving his father, hearing that story that he knows over and over, and how much he can appreciate that. And yeah, I just love that moment in the book.
Anytime you see the tension kind of slough off, whether it's through music or through the Dodgers or through redundant stories, I think it's pretty special for kids.
Sure. Well, I want to, before we open it up, maybe we could talk about the tension a little bit. And originally I thought about opening it up with this, that, you're writing this in 2016, the context of which these young men are going to school is that it's at the beginning of the Trump era, right? And there is a lot of things happen in 2016. We lose Harper Lee, we lose David Bowie, we lose Prince, all of those things. But also there is a moment where immigrant families are really feeling the fire, right? And there's so much talk of building a wall then. There's so much talk of overturning DACA, both those things we didn't see. But we just saw like a major influx of ICE activity, right? And there's a moment, I think it's with Jonah, where they're kind of talking about their views and their viewpoints, and he might be more conservative. And it'd just be interesting to see if this was written right now, what they'd be reacting to, or how would you handle his story in particular.
That's so interesting. I've never thought about that. So yeah, this was during the 16-17 school year. And I started at the schools in August of that year where, the election was pretty, I don't want to say entertaining because in retrospect that, feels dispassionate. But at the time, there were lots of imitations and, any anxiety. The guys in South LA who are all Latino at this school, Animo Pep Brown, I'm not sure if I've mentioned the name. They could kind of, one thing young people do is deal with tension and stress by making fun of it. I think that's pretty true across the board. And that's what they did. And then what they were told would happen didn't happen. The opposite happened. And I didn't know what to do really myself, because these guys were feeling it. Carlos was undocumented. His parents were undocumented. It was real. And I remember during that time, I was talking to one of their beloved teachers, Mr. Sandoval, who taught actually American history, but shared a lot of threads of his upbringing with some of these students, just about his job and his mission and how, how that altered or if it became more stressful. And I presumed that he would give a certain kind of answer that, yes, definitely more stressful. But he actually said it was energizing to be part of a moment that was terrible for them. Not just the election itself, but what it meant about the national consciousness and how they were seen. But he said his job became to make his students not be scared.
Mm-hmm.
He said that was really empowering, and and that he took a lot of energy that year. And in the meantime, at Beverly Hills, where there are probably a lot more conservative viewpoints than you would expect, and at Animo Pep Brown, which the ideology is probably less diverse, the ability of these guys to just talk and listen to each other, listen to things they don't like, Beverly Hills in particular, was not something I observed in any adults during that time. Or as you mentioned, if I were writing it 4 years later, I would say it's worse. The inability of adults, at least adults I know, to entertain even kind of a slightly different angle of looking at politics or social movements. These young guys, kids, could do it. They could have a conversation and learn, maybe think a little bit differently, and it would get tense. I'm trying to think of anything specific. There was a moment at Beverly Hills, it was after the election, but before the inauguration, where a female student protest kind of turned into a ugly chant on the lunch plaza, like build that wall sort of thing. And it was just a small group of guys, not guys in my book group, but students at the school, probably making a scene because they could, but it was ugly. It made you feel pretty bad about the school and about where we all were. And the boys, obviously, they get really fired up, especially when they see adults acting like children. And I remember kind of unpacking that, and everyone was tense and a little red, and especially when they were talking sort of big picture. But as we got to more specifics, and Jonah, sorry, I'll wrap this up, but Jonah was talking about his views actually came from his father, who was abusive, and his mother had to sort of run away with her kids. And I mean, a really long and terrible story that ended up with him at Beverly Hills. And he was saying how he doesn't understand how he takes views from this father who he hates and will never see again. And just the complicated flows of parents and children and the places we live. He was kind of, it seemed like he was processing it himself as he was speaking, and it was really confusing, and maybe there was some shame involved with it. But the fact that he was talking about it and these guys were listening, and it was kind of, it was meaningful.
Right, like teachable moment for all of them, because
Yes, and
that's what I was impressed.
They didn't know what the lesson was or
Yeah,
anything, but they knew they were learning something.
right. And they knew to be willing to listen and, like you said, to open their heart and to be, to see other people. I think your example, they really, it fed off of it. We have some questions in the chat that I'm going to ask you here. Do you want me to ask them?
It's up to you. I can also ask them as the moderator, whichever you
Okay.
prefer. But just also note to everyone, you can definitely put questions in the chat, but you can also unmute yourself cautiously and respectfully. But to start with, we've got one from Miriam who's wondering, Jeff, why you chose to write about boys instead of girls, or both boys and girls.
Thank you. That's a good question. And people have asked me that along the way. And there's kind of I guess a technical reason, and then there's maybe a larger reason. The technical reason, I mean, I think girls are interesting, and I'm married to one, and I'm raising one. And I'm very invested in girls and understanding. But I thought that that having teenage girls and teenage guys in the same room, talking about some of these deep things wouldn't be as authentic. Just that there'd be some more posturing, if that makes sense. And also that being a guy myself, I wasn't sure how I wasn't sure if parents would be thrilled about a middle-aged man kind of talking about the emotional lives of their daughters. But greater has to do, I think we've touched on it already, just I think the emotional lives of boys are, even though, we live in a more progressive society and there's books written about, sensitivity in boys, I think it's still a machismo culture we live in, and the emotional lives of boys are marginalized, and I think it's hard for them to exist in that sometimes. And so, yeah, I thought it would be interesting just to, show some of that real vulnerability and complexity of thoughts that we don't normally associate with teenage boys, really deeply complex thoughts and perspectives on how they see the world.
For sure. We've got a second question from Bert, who is wondering what your experiences with Robert taught you about what to focus on as you study these boys.
Oh, that's interesting. Thank you. I probably never thought about it specifically or definitively. But Douglas brought it up in the beginning, just the idea of masks, and it's called The Short and Tragic Life of Robert Peace, and I didn't come up with that title, and I never really liked it. I've come around to it But the tragedy of that title, to me, is that you have this guy, a really bright, flawed, loving, complicated guy who's just surrounded by hundreds of people who would do anything for him if he let them. They would want nothing more than just to help. And he didn't let them. I try not to psychoanalyze Rob, but he actually expressed this openly to me and to other friends, that he saw just the act of asking for help, even the simplest kind of help, like sitting with a friend and letting them listen, as kind of an expression of weakness, maybe even shame. So I think that's maybe what I brought, or what I tried to bring to being with these boys, which I think is a much more hopeful story. I really admire these boys, but I guess I no matter what we were talking about, it might have been, the time Luis stapled Byron's hand, or it might have been Tio's father's alcoholism. I mean, it ranged in substance, but I think I always tried to sort of keep that present. Just the idea of being there for each other, and that, you're not defined by your weakness or the worst thing that's ever happened to you. You're often, made stronger by those things. And that there's value in, telling stories about yourself.
Absolutely. We have a kind of a follow-up question to that, and from Bert as well, who's curious if you'd like to share what you think their lives will be like in 10 years.
Oh, these guys? That's interesting, because that's actually, that's something I came back to a lot with them in these meetings. I guess you'd call it one of my prompts was, like, where do you see yourself in 5 years, 10 years, 40 years? And they mostly had funny answers, but sometimes pretty serious. And they were in the middle, again, this highly determinative moment in their lives, applying to college. So part of the point of the whole book was, like, you go to school for 12 years and things happen, emergencies with your families. And one guy's mother was bedridden with an illness since he was in 8th grade, a Beverly Hills guy. But for those 12 years, what's going to happen basically between 8 a.m. and 3 p.m. in school. And then suddenly you're a senior and you don't know where you're going to be in a year or 10. And you don't know who you'll be with and whether you'll be happy, and you don't know how you're going to pay for it. And those unknowns are the source of a lot of their stress and anxiety and some erratic behavior, but it's also the source of a lot of their wonder and connection with each other, and their triumph, and the things you want to take with you, and the things I think these guys will take with them. So I can't say what they'll be doing occupationally. I think they'll be good. And I think a lot of what this book is about is learning that, you grow up in school, it feels like it's going to be a straight line to 10 years from now. Like, I want to be an engineer. 10 years I'll have gone through the school and I'll be an engineer. And what they were spending a lot of that year doing was learning that those lines are not straight, that they're very crooked, and the things you're told will work out don't always work out, and how you adapt to that messiness of being a person is one of the most repeated words in school, which is resilience. That's where it comes from.
Is there a plan to follow up? Is there a part 2?
Oh, I mean, no, I keep in touch with all the guys pretty regularly, and they all read the book when I was writing it, which maybe is kind of bad journalism, but I thought it was respectful, and they really helped with fact checking. And it was neat to see them, even a year or two removed, looking back on things they did and said in high school and saying like, no way I stapled Byron's hand. Oh wait, yeah, that was actually the best thing I did in high school.
Can I ask a question to Douglas in his role as a teacher?
Sure.
Both of you guys, thanks so much for doing this. It's incredibly interesting and important. How would your young men react to the young men depicted in Jeff's book?
Oh, I felt a lot of them were very similar. You know, I talk about this young kid a lot. He's not a kid anymore, but I had him as a sophomore, and he didn't do so well his first semester. You know, he got a B in my class, and he really thought hard about what he had done that first semester. And he came to talk to me and really made a vow to change. And he changed his whole trajectory of his high school, and he went to Harvard on a full ride. And, you know, and he's a East LA kid, and really it all came to a point where he really thought about the effort, and he thought about the effort that people have given for him, and he was really thoughtful, and he put in that work and broadened his horizons. It was not just about school, it was about all of the other things that he could do to give back. And I think, you know, he just graduated from Harvard and is doing well and moving back to LA and so on and so on. And just a fantastic story. And I have another student who very similar, who he got cut his sophomore year. He got cut from the soccer team, and he came in, he talked to me, and I was like, well, what are you going to do now? And he's like, well, you know, last year I was in the play and I had this small role. I think I'm gonna go back out and do the play. Well, come 3 years ago, he was on the traveling circuit for Hamilton, you know, and that because of what Loyola provides and the resources we have, you know, I say that we're not like the best school in LA. We're really good at what we do, and we're very fortunate to have resources enough where if one thing gets shut off from a student, another thing opens up, and there's so many avenues, and that's what we're fortunate. So I think, could those guys go here? I know you mentioned, one of them mentioned our rival Harvard Westlake, and you know, sister school Marlboro, and Loyola is so different than that we get so many students from everywhere that I always tell people, don't judge us by our parking lot. You know, you could see a lot of students who really are in need, who have varied lives after school. And so a lot of these young men, they fit right on in, you know. Thanks for asking, Bert.
Yeah.
Well, you both showed us that that you are good, and I'm so grateful that you spent time at Chevalier's Books tonight. So thank you.
Always a good time here.
Thank you so much, everyone, for coming. It was a fantastic time, Jeff and Doug. You're fantastic. And I really implore all of you to drop us a line at chevaliersbooks@gmail.com and get all of their books. We have them in store, and we'd be happy to sell them to you. So without any further ado, good night and see you next time.
Thank you
you
all so
all.
much.
Thank you, Jeff. Congratulations with this. This is fantastic
You bet.
endeavor that you took on.
It's really kind of you.
Thanks, everyone.